wrong?
Duh.
What is good and bad?
I always refer to myself as a contrarian.
The search for common sense and the defense of free speech.
Duh.
And I'm recording.
Okay, Tommy, what are people telling us? What's the feedback we've gotten so far? What is the input that
Whoa.
our audience, our fans, what are they saying?
All right.
What's our focus groups? We funded a few focus groups, right?
Yeah. Or we're just going here?
Yeah. This is the Wild West. This is rock and roll. We're not gonna write a script for this. We're just gonna go. We're just gonna be impulsive.
All right. Welcome to the Duh podcast.
Sorry. Welcome.
I am your host, Tommy Park, and I'm here with my more intelligent counter host, Michael McGovern.
Hi.
Oh, well. You're supposed to be the brains. I'm the bronze.
I'm the brains, the bronze, the...
No, I'm the looks. We discovered.
I thought bronze is like muscles. It's not necessarily that you look good.
Oh, shit.
Yeah. You're the face of the organization.
I have a good face for radio, so... People keep telling me that.
We have to arm wrestle to figure out who the bronze is.
All right, well, I think we're actually recording here, so...
Okay. I'm recording.
We decided to do a pre-discussion before going into before introducing our guest, and that was actually based off of the massive amount of emails and phone calls we received from
I'm not going to ask you to define the word massive there.
Please don't, yeah.
Okay.
Because obviously, as everybody knows, listening, our podcast has been a hit, a massive hit.
Yeah.
But one thing that I think that our listeners have suggested is that we talk about the guests before we bring them on, because people want to hear, for some reason, they want to hear our views.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why.
Yeah.
And they also would like kind of to give everybody a little more of a paraphrasing, if you will, before diving into the subject.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. I don't know why anyone cares what we think, but I think it's a good idea.
So and then the other thing that our guests, our listeners have requested. Sorry, I'm drinking some red wine right now.
Drinking on the job.
Our listeners have requested that they feel a little let down, from what I understand, that we are not pushing back on our guests enough and challenging them enough. They've stated that in our first episode we set it up that way. So
basically, what are they saying? We have like the training wheels on, or are they saying we're not being as assertive as we? What's the problem? What's the problem here?
I think that the problem is when we said we were out to bring back critical thinking in the world and to challenge people to think for themselves.
Yeah.
When we just blindly, I think people are saying that we're just listening to our guests and not really digging into to challenge if the belief is genuine enough. Is
right.
Kind of what I'm getting.
Yeah. That's a good balance. That's something you have to balance, because I remember growing up when I was watching Bill O'Reilly, he turned me off because I thought that all he did was invite his guests on the show and then just talk over them the whole time. And so it's like a balance between like hearing what people have to think, or have to say, and then how much do you push back? How much do you let them finish their point? And so I think probably at this point we just got to figure that out, and maybe just and I gotta, even though it's been a few of my friends on the podcast so far, I gotta let them know that even if I'm gonna be a little more assertive, that it's not nothing personal. It's just the debate. It's just the nature of a good fun debate, talk, conversation. I guess.
Yeah, exactly. I know the last episode with Famo on the subject of Islam. Well, I got a lot of questions on why I personally didn't challenge more of her beliefs, and part of that reason is I had a little bit of technical difficulties. For some reason, it's not that easy to talk someone in San Diego, New York, and Kenya.
Yeah, I don't know what the problem
ridiculous.
is. Yeah.
Ridiculous. It should be just flawless, but
yeah.
And I for those listeners out there who were expecting me to unleash at the end, I do apologize for that, and I do promise to bring that subject back in the near future.
So we're gonna unleash. We're gonna take the training wheels off. We're gonna take our, pull our diapers off. What other metaphors of
I think you stop at the diaper one. That
diaper's good.
Yeah, diaper's good.
Okay. Are you wearing a diaper?
We're still recording, Mike.
Sorry. You're not wearing diapers still, right? Or because
I doubt anybody is still listening by now, but we do have a guest. we do have a guest that we're going. We are going to still play that episode, right?
Yes, he's coming up.
Okay.
His name is Luke, and we had a long conversation about socialism and capitalism, and this is we recorded this. I think this was like our first interview, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. This was several months ago. Yeah.
Yeah. So after all of what we just said, you're about to listen to a podcast where maybe we probably could have been more assertive yet again. But I think it's good.
I do too, and I think that one thing that I'd like to say to the listeners, as they're listening to this, I know that in this podcast we do really defend capitalism.
Yeah.
And I find it interesting that today, for those of you who think that if you defend capitalism, that doesn't mean you're a racist or a fat greedy businessman. It's possible to reasonably think that is the best form of government. And I challenge anybody who kind of more takes the Marxist side to listen to both points and ignore, don't get trapped by the sexiness of Marxism or the the idealistic piece of Marxism, and actually think for yourself there.
Yeah, I think it's important. I like this because, if we in the beginning of each episode talk a little bit about what we actually believe, that'll kind of set the stage, because I prefer people to let me know their bias up front. Like when I was, in journalism school, it was all about like objective writing, objective reporting, and there's no such thing. And so, it's good to let people know that we're definitely capitalistic, and that we brought Luke on to talk specifically about how we think socialism is a fantasy land place. It's good. And by the way, I had another conversation with Luke post this interview that lasted another 2.5 hours off the record, and I think it was very constructive. I'll just say that. And lastly, one more thing I'll say that I don't think we talked about in this episode, but that I think capitalism is not only is it a system of economics, but it is more than that. It's like the evolutionary hierarchy in action in economics. It's like the way humans would organize themselves anyways in the world, and it's kind of clear to see that everyone's trading with everyone now, and this is kind of the way we evolved. Like, I do one thing for you, you do one thing for me, blah 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 blah.
Yeah. Why is the association of capitalism tied closely to racism?
Probably because Northern Europeans were the ones to initiate colonialism and the stock market and things like that, I would say. Probably one big reason.
Yeah, I don't think we talk about race in this.
I don't think we did either.
Yeah. Well.
Well,
I guess. Well, we'll let everybody listen for themselves, and we really, really, really appreciate the feedback and
and all the
I guess
love.
and all the love. Please be as candid and honest and blunt as possible, I'd say.
And please stop sending us your bras. And Tommy, you got like what, 10 bras in the mail?
Yeah, my girlfriend's getting mad at the
Yeah.
bra situation.
Okay, so stop doing that, please.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we've got some great exciting stuff coming up in the coming months, right, Tommy?
Oh yes, I think we were just getting started. Like we said, we're taking the training wheels off, and we're reaching out to some very interesting guests, and they'll set up some very good shows.
Yeah. Shall we do it?
Cue the music.
Ba-ba-da-ba-ba-ba-ba.
No, the song that we made.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Enjoy. Welcome to the UMDA podcast. We are very excited today to welcome Luke Pickrell. Luke has a degree in sociology from the University of Oregon and currently works in special education in the Bay Area in California. He is a self-described socialist and Marxist and has closely associated with the International Socialist Organization, or the ISO. Luke, welcome. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you both for having me.
Yeah, you got it. I think a good place to start off would be to talk about the recent protests and riots that happened when Milo Yiannopoulos showed up at UC Berkeley to try to give a speech and was eventually shut down from those riots. We spoke about this a little bit in our opening episode and kind of wanted to pick it up from there and figured you'd be a good guy to talk about it because we know that you helped organize some of the protests, and though you didn't associate yourself with the Antifa or the people involved in the riots or the violence that eventually the talk was shut down and that although it wasn't your goal, you said you were happy with it. Just give us a little bit of background about why you wanted to protest against him in this way, and tell us about that night.
Sure. I guess the background that I was looking at, and I think other groups on the UC Berkeley campus were looking at, was who he is, what he talks about when he goes on tour, and then also what had happened at other events that he participated in, what had happened at other campuses that he talked at. I guess something that was large in everyone's minds was what had happened, I believe, up in Washington, which was the school, I think it was the University of Washington that he went to right before Cal, in which there was a confrontation right in front of where he was talking. I understand it. A protester was shot by some right-wing supporter, and then, the police kind of did their thing and took the guy in and then didn't charge him and let him go. So there was a fear of what might happen. That led some groups to put a lot of pressure on the UC Berkeley administration and say that the UC Berkeley administration should be the ones who should say his presence isn't welcome on the UC Berkeley campus. What he talks about is not what the UC Berkeley community stands for. There's a possibility that it's going to be a dangerous presence. The perspective that I had and the ISO took, and I think that also some other groups had, is that we're not comfortable giving that type of power to the UC Berkeley administration. The UC Berkeley administration, for as much out wanting to promote free speech and free ideas, has a very long track record of being very selective in terms of who gets to talk about things on campus and what gets to be taught on campus. So, for example, not even, I don't know, 2 months before this happened, there was a class that was scheduled to be taught at UC Berkeley talking about the Israeli occupation of Palestine, and that class was withdrawn for no good reason. And then eventually, after protest, it was reinstated. So that was just kind of one example of why it's always a dangerous thing to rely on the administration, in the larger context, the state, to be the ones who decides, who's going to protect us or who's going to stop someone from doing something. So with that in mind, yeah, go ahead.
Well, so Luke, I just wanted to, I mentioned in our last podcast when we briefly brought this up, I'm kind of convinced that a lot of the people that showed up at Berkeley were either there because they wanted to be destructive, or because, it's kind of the new cool thing to do, to show up and aggressively protest this way. So, and I know that you wouldn't label yourself either of those two things, but would you grant me that a lot of the people that did show up wouldn't even know who this guy was, or didn't even know who he was or what he stands for?
Well, I didn't talk to everyone, but I think most people knew who he was. And from what I saw, there were about 2,000 would be on the high number, but maybe 2,000 people out there gathered around the building that he was in. And then maybe 100 or so black bloc folks who decided to use direct confrontation as their tactic. But I think everyone knew who he was. And I think the majority of people weren't sure how they wanted to go forward, other than they wanted to let people know that they're not okay with what Milo does.
So what's the big problem with what he does? What is like a bullet point why he's such a bad person?
Well, that's an interesting thing, because I actually don't think he's such a bad person necessarily, or such a dangerous person. I think he's mostly an entertainer. I think that a lot of what he does is kind of for shock value, and I actually don't know to what extent he even believes what he does, but I'm also not really interested in picking his brain. The one thing that I really focused on, because eventually this could get into a discussion of who gets shut down, who doesn't. As I understand it, he was going to launch at UC Berkeley alongside this other person a campaign to out undocumented students across universities, and he was going to start doing that at the UC Berkeley campus. So that, in my mind, crosses a certain line, because that's actually really dangerous, not just in the abstract, but right now. It's one thing to say you're going to out an undocumented person, I don't know, 1 or 2 years ago. It's another thing to say you're going to do it now. So that crosses the line in terms of when you're actually coming onto campus and you're going to be endangering another person's safety. All the other things that he says, he's a racist, he's a sexist, he's misogynist. Those are all bad things, but those are all things that hopefully could be talked about and debated about in some type of forum, in some type of larger space. Then again, that's not what he's about. He's about putting on a show. And I guess the other side of this is who comes to his protests. And who comes to his events. And I've heard people say that he draws increasingly this, I don't really know how to define alt-right completely, but he draws with him this kind of new, kind of rebranded strand of white nationalism, or you could maybe say semi-fascism. And those people, whether or not they agree with him, they tend to organize around his events. And then, of course, he's associated with Steve Bannon, and they're kind of all degrees of separation.
Just to clarify, though, if he weren't to, if you didn't make the statement that he was coming there to out an undocumented person, then you wouldn't have a problem with him speaking at Berkeley?
If he wasn't going to do that, I would be not happy that he was coming to talk at Berkeley, but I would be less concerned about the actual event being shut down. Regardless, regardless, what I liked to see, and I was glad to see this, was that a lot of people came out and they came together around a common issue. And it's a common issue that I think is now more important than ever, which is to stand up against racism, sexism, misogyny, attacks on immigrant people.
So, are you still proud of the result that happened of him being shut down? Like, you would still say you're happy about
Yeah,
that? The way
here. But and Luke, before you answer that, I kind of want to jump in just to clarify, because you brought up a few things. So you brought up the incident that happened in Washington where someone was shot near a Milo protest, saying that it was a Milo supporter who shot someone who was protesting. I remember that story. I don't quite remember. I thought it was the other way around. I thought it was someone who was shot waiting in line to see Milo. I don't remember. I could look it up now, but whether or not that be the case, it seems that your reservations about Milo speaking were then a little more focused on security of the people attending the event. And then you also spoke about administrations, like the actual universities themselves, and whether or not they have the ability to invite or disinvite speakers that they brought on. So then there's that issue, which I know that it was a private. Was it a private group on Berkeley's campus who rented the space and hired the security?
The college Republicans.
The college Republicans, right? So it wasn't the administration itself that had invited Milo onto the campus. It was someone else.
Right.
So I think what Tommy's getting at right now is at the end of the day, if it had been a private group on campus who had paid money, hired security to hold this event, and if it was still shut down, I think what the question we're trying kind of dancing around right now is, do you believe in Milo's right to speak publicly, not negating your right to peaceful protest?
I believe in it's a hard question for me to answer, because I feel like often kind of the right. I think I know where this is kind of going, and it's important discussion is around this idea of a right to free speech, someone's right to free speech. And it's hard for me to take that out of the context with which it's in. He can come on to campus if he wants and try to say something. He does not. I would organize people to try to stop him from doing that if there was a feeling that people were going to be hurt or going to be targeted. That's when I would feel more concerned about actually stopping him from speaking.
Right.
Otherwise, I would encourage, and I think this was the hope of the coalition that was on the UC Berkeley campus, to have this be an event in which people came out to organize together and to create some type of longer lasting organization. I would not defend his right to free speech out of some kind of free floating belief in free speech, because I have to kind of know the context. Yeah, does that kind of help?
Well, I don't know, Tommy. What do you think? Do you have anything?
Well, I mean, the other piece that when I asked you, you're happy with the result, right? It sounds like that's a yes, right? You wouldn't take it back. You wouldn't undo the fact that his speech was shut down, correct?
So the thing that I'm most happy about is just how many people came out there. I mean, the fact that 2,000 people came out there is great. If a small group had come out there and had gotten shut down, that wouldn't have made me so pleased. So the thing that I was most pleased with was seeing how many folks came out to say that they didn't stand for this stuff.
But do you think that 2,000 people showing up and this making international news also the best thing? That was the best thing for Milo, and then his book ended up going #1 on Amazon overnight. He's on every station. People who never heard of him now know exactly who he is, right? I mean, isn't that like not the goal of what you and some of these organizations wanted?
Not really. I mean, I think the view I take is that we're not so much concerned about kind of the attention he gets as understanding that the ideas that he's putting forward are increasingly getting traction, not just within, the media and on Amazon, but in the highest halls of power for the people who run this country. So that's what's more concerning to me. These ideas that he's talking about aren't going to go away, even if his book didn't sell #1 on Amazon. What I'm more concerned about is that what he's talking about has, real impact on real people's lives, and that there needs to be organization against that. Well, both when he comes to campus and, for example, when ICE would come to campus, maybe to, and I know it's a theoretical, but theoretically to deport someone who he had called out.
Okay, so I don't want to indict someone for something that they haven't even committed yet, which I'm sure you would agree with. Now I remember because you had publicly shared events on organizing this protest at Berkeley, and I think one of the events was Femmes versus Nazis, right? Was that the title of the event that you had shared?
Oh gosh, maybe. I'm not aware of such an event.
Well, I think that because I remember when we had spoken before, that was the one of the events I had realized that you had organized against the talk, and I looked at some of the tenets of the event, and the goal was to shut it down. I guess my question is, if he had been able to speak, would that have been a failure of the protest?
Yeah. I'll cover the first part and then the second part.
Yeah.
The Femmes versus Nazis thing, I would imagine where that came up is perhaps there was a group called Femmes versus Nazis that was somehow associated within this coalition of groups. To be honest, the planning for this, I think could have been a lot better. I think it could have been a lot organized. And so I am in no way affiliated with that group. I'll say this, I don't agree in using the term Nazi. I wouldn't call him a Nazi. So if I had control over this event, I would not call it anything versus Nazis. I'll say that. And then the second part, Michael, was if he had been able to speak, would that have been a failure?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think so. Not in my mind. Again, the organizing for this could have been a little better, and it was never clear to me if having him not speak was one of the hard demands. If it had been one of the hard demands, I think there would have needed to have been more discussion around that, because I'm not completely comfortable with where some of the no platform positions have gone recently. So if he had been allowed to speak, I would have withheld my judgment, and I would have based success on, as I did how it turned out, mostly based on how many people came out.
Right, but don't you think some of the wrong people showed up? I mean, like you said, you don't agree with the fact of labeling him a Nazi, but a lot of these people were there shouting, right, F Nazis. And then when the some people showed up with these "Make America Great" hats on, they were beaten unconscious while they all smacked them over the head with metal flagpoles. I mean, like that. I know you're not for that. I would never claim that you are, but wouldn't you agree that like there's an attraction of a lot of the wrong people that showed up at this event, and that's not a win?
No, I would say that people who got into violent conflicts, and I'm also not really comfortable saying who perpetrated the most violence, because unless one were to have been standing over it watching over everything, there is a real bias, because that's kind of how the propaganda works in terms of who was the most violent, who was just defending themselves. But I do not think that the majority of people there had it as their tactic to physically confront people. I think the majority of people there, and I'd say the vast majority, I'd say that there were maybe 100 people there who had that as their tactic, and 1,800 people there who did not. I'd say the majority of people there didn't necessarily have a tactic. They maybe weren't necessarily used to protesting someone. They certainly weren't necessarily comfortable with the black bloc tactic. And I think that was seen at a certain point in the demonstration, in which, after these folks pulled down the barricade, they kind of realized that they were kind of on their own in a sense. People were kind of trying to urge the crowd forward, come on, let's all move forward and, maybe we can take the building, something like that. And people didn't leave, which is kind of a new thing. They weren't necessarily put off, but they also didn't start running forward. So that tells me that the majority of people there didn't really know what to do. Most of them weren't really well organized to have come up with a clear, decisive action. And if it had to be organized again, I think people would be organized. And if I was the organizer, if the ISO was the organizer, or if I was organizing based on what I believe in, I'd think long and hard about what would be the best tactic to take.
Yeah, and like we said, peaceful protest is a good thing, and I think from sounds like your account, most of the people there, that was sort of their goal. I think kind of going back to what Tommy said, and maybe this can kind of help transition us a little bit into your socialist Marxist views. You say that the ISO is kind of more aligned with the Trotsky version of communism or Marxism, sort of a more revolutionary stance on things. As you probably know, as a Trotsky fan, he was exiled to Siberia for a few years after trying to organize labor in early Russia in the early days of before the revolution happened in the early 20th century. And Trotsky was exiled to Siberia and arrested trying to organize labor and unionize. And he came back stronger and eventually founded the Red Army that took over and established the Soviet Union. Is there a fear with the protesting Milo or the silencing of Milo that the same thing is happening with these conservatives? They're becoming sort of martyrs of their cause because they're not allowed to speak publicly?
I think that's a good question. Something tricky is happening, because on one hand, the right wing and even, the quote unquote democracy that we have now, even, I don't know, I guess the Democrats or the liberals, they're not necessarily supporters of free speech. So that's one thing we have to keep in mind. But I think that there can be the argument made that they're able to pose as defenders of free speech because of mistakes that are being made or have been made, either by people who would consider them maybe farther to the left, but also, and I'm not super well versed on this, but I kind of refer to it as I think it's referred to in in the common language is, the call out ID kind of political correctness culture that I think does tend to silence debate and discussion when it's much easier and much better to have a discussion about something. So to answer your question, there are certain things happening that would allow someone like Milo Yiannopoulos and other folks to say, we defend free speech, even when they don't.
Well, and I just want to hammer down on this point that you made of, you think it was 80% of the people there were not, had no intentions of violence, or they were there for a civil, peaceful protest, which again we all agree on. I just remember one of the organizations that helped organize this event was a organization called BAM. Are you familiar with them? BAMN. By any means necessary, right? And they were their leaders were very proud of shutting it down. The initial bulletin to come out was, let's get this event shut down, and by any means necessary, meaning even violence, which they are proud of. And I mean, I don't know the exact numbers, but they made claims of like 30 or 40% of the crowd were BAM members. So I just don't know if I agree with the fact that it was only 100 out of 2,000 that were there to take the stage by force.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I guess all I can say on that is that BAM, because of what their kind of political strategy is and their political organizing strategy is, it would be to their advantage if there were, in fact, many more people who were willing to use their tactic in order to shut it down. It would make them look better. It would make them look successful. It's not what I saw. And
but do you
what
agree
else,
with organizations like BAM? I mean, like, are like, it sounds like you don't support the by any means necessary type of tactic.
What I don't support it, and I'm not. It's not that I don't support groups that see the action or the deed as the main event. So that's kind of an anarchist principle, which is the idea that if you just create something so intense, so kind of eye-opening to the masses, perhaps a clash, with the state that is so powerful, that will be the event that really wakes people up to what's going on, that transforms the working class into, their revolutionary form, that the state is smashed, and that it's through that one event that the revolution is realized.
Okay.
And I'm not calling BAM a revolutionary group. The reason I don't agree with that is because that's not how these things work. It takes time, it takes organization, and I don't think you can base something like this on one instantaneous event, but more so what comes out of it. Are political lessons learned? Are bonds made? Are people stronger now than they were before and more prepared to mobilize?
Okay. Yeah, and I think that's a good place to kind of pivot and talk a little bit about your socialist theories in general. So you said that both the Democratic and Republican parties in the United States are just kind of, from your mind, alternate versions of capitalism that ultimately need to be overthrown, sort of in this perpetual revolution that you're kind of describing here. What is it about socialism that attracts you to believe it's the best way to move forward politically and economically, and how does this concept of revolution fit into that?
What appeals to me about socialism and Marxism is that it's a very broad way of looking at society. I was first drawn to it through looking at the individual problems that manifest themselves in society. For me, it was the prison industrial complex and the criminal justice system and how messed up that is. And then looking at things and seeing how they're all tied back into much larger systems. And that then led me to see that it's not so much that the criminal justice system or environmental destruction or war or racism are all the results of kind of faulty ideas or individual mistakes or things that can be solved just in themselves, but that they're all manifestations of a larger systemic issue. And then what is that systemic issue? And then coming to the conclusion that it's capitalism, that it's the dominant economic system that we live under. And then part and parcel with that is, okay, well, what is capitalism? Has it existed forever? If it hasn't existed forever, does it have to continue to exist? And if it's not going to continue to exist, what can come after it? And then that's socialism.
So what about Marxism and socialism that attracts you to that and thinks that it's a better system than capitalism?
Yeah. Well, the one thing that Marx did, well, he did a lot of things, but one thing was that he has this idea called historical materialism, which is kind of his way of seeing the flow of history and how history is kind of made and how history progresses. And then he's also still, I think, the most authoritative figure on what capitalism is and what are the rules of the system, how do people interact within the system. And all of this analysis isn't really based on a moral position, although morality is a really big piece of it. It's more so how it's equally as seeing that human society does advance through different stages. And capitalism is one of those stages. And it played a historically progressive role at one point. It no longer does. And now, like every other stage in human history that came before it, it's clashing up against its contradictions. And we see those contradictions every day. And that's where the moral outrages come from, especially. And so then the question is, overthrowing capitalism, not just because it's so morally repugnant, but because because socialism then is the next stage in human development. It's actually the next stage in which humanity can realize the full productive capacity of everything that's out there, how we can realize all of our intelligence. Capitalism holds us back in so many ways, and also, literally threatens our very existence on the planet.
Okay, so you mentioned contradiction there. One quote that always kind of stuck with me when I was thinking about, I continue to think about this stuff and ask questions and figure out what I really believe. But one quote I once heard was that socialism is what can I get from society, and capitalism asks the same question because it's the human nature to want something for yourself. But the answer and the ability to get something from society requires the capitalist to think about what other people need in order to acquire wealth. So when I study Marxism, I study socialism. I've always been confused about this idea of labor-owned means of production, about a community and the workers, the people who produce the labor, everyone owning the means of production. I don't quite understand how that would actually, in the real world, how that would actually play out and how that's different from entrepreneurs or people in capitalist societies already.
Yeah, that is an interesting quote. I think one way you can see how it would play out would be how certain co-ops exist now. There are smaller ones, like there are so many in Berkeley. There are also larger ones. There's this very large one in Spain. It's called Mondragon, I think. Now, it's not possible for a co-op to exist and thrive within the larger system of capitalism, so Mondragon especially is starting to face a lot of issues simply because it has to exist within the capitalist market. But it's an example of how workers can collectively own and control the means of production. So there is no kind of boss that stands over them. There is no kind of CEO or executive above them there. But they come together and through cooperation with one another are able to make the factory work because they're the workers.
But like you said, it exists within a capitalist society. So whether or not these co-ops establish some sort of hierarchical system in the way they work, they still benefit from the protection and the production of food and certain things like that from within a capitalist society. I mean, can you give me an example of successful co-ops from Venezuela or Cuba or the former Soviet Union that were more towards this ideal?
Not really, but that could be just because I don't know a lot about them. But that's also because I don't want to get trapped into thinking that co-op is kind of what we're all aiming here for. I think that was more kind of an example of what workers' control over the means of production could look like. I'd also say that really there has been no benefit to Mondragon existing within the capitalist system as far as the workers are concerned, because the workers are losing their jobs, because their pay is being reduced. And essentially, I don't know how long this co-op is even going to last because it's likely going to go out of business.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess.
Yeah.
So the co-op itself, still the original question. I'm still quite not sure how it really works. I mean, besides there not being some sort of boss like you indicated.
How socialism works?
Yeah, I mean, like what does it look like? What is a community ownership of production look like? I just really don't get it.
Can I give an example?
Yeah.
Like if I invent something, right? Let's call it the light bulb, which obviously is going to be great for all of society, and I want to now sell this product. I want to manufacture and sell this product to society. But under Marxism, right? I can't. I'm forced to hand over that invention of mine, right? So I mean, I guess walk me through how that would work.
That's not how I see it. I think that's kind of the common assumption, and it might also have been how it played out in the Soviet Union. When you say hand over the light bulb, you mean like hand it over to the state?
Yeah.
In a sense? Yeah. So that's also a common misconception about what socialism is, and that comes directly from the idea that the Soviet Union was socialist, was a workers' state, when it was not. It was, how I see it, it was considered state capitalist. So the state in itself almost became kind of like the ruling body over society. But going back to your light bulb example, so you create this light bulb, you have a good idea, you create something. You're under no obligation to do anything with that. The only thing, or one of the things though, is that in our society, workers have to sell their labor, to use the jargon, in order to produce that light bulb.
But doesn't Marx say the abolition of private property, and then uses these exact examples of when an entrepreneur or bourgeoisie, right, creates something, he is forced to hand it over to the state? Or am I misunderstanding something?
I haven't read anything about that. I think when he talks about private property, he's talking about the means of production. So that means the big factories, the big workplaces the areas in which people come together to create those things. That's what he talks about when he means private property.
Okay. So I kind of want to go back to what you were saying about the Soviet Union being kind of a state-run capitalism. So in other words, that they replaced one bourgeois for another with the government. Would you agree with that?
Not really. To be honest, this is not something that I'm super well versed in, is like, what was the Soviet Union? Was it this or this? What I know is that it wasn't capitalism as it's kind of commonly thought of, in that there was no private property. Most of it was state owned, and most of what was produced could be distributed amongst people. And also there was a planned economy, in the sense that there was no longer really as much of an emphasis on production for profit, but production for use. So I think that's how you're able to see these really big advances in infrastructure and technology. And at the same time, the majority of people in the Soviet Union were not free, not only because they had a state standing over them, but because they were still forced to work in order to make a living. And that's kind of the main thing. Under capitalism, the majority of people are forced to work in order to survive. And that doesn't have to be the case anymore. We're such a rich world, and not to mention country. No one should have to be obligated to labor in order to survive.
Yeah, and there could be an argument that the reason we're at where we are now is because of the riches that the capitalist system has provided people with. But I wanted to just kind of, I know, we can kind of discuss the example of Soviet Union without really going into many details, because of course I'm not an expert either. But correct me if I'm wrong. Marx kind of, like the Marxist dream is sort of an anarcho-communism. It's sort of like a stateless, classless, complete community ownership of production, where everyone gets what they need and not a thing more, right? But am I wrong in saying that Marx agreed that it was first the revolution that would transition to socialism, which then the dream of that would eventually lead to his ultimate goal of this communist dream, where it is stateless, like it is anarchy, but it's anarchy controlled by the labor. Is that not right?
Yeah, I think the traditional path, the one that I think is most clearly laid out, is that there needs to be some type of workers-led, working-class-led revolution that takes control of the state. Because the state, and this can go into another topic, but the state is not some kind of free-floating third-party system under capitalism. It takes the form of, it expresses, at the end of the day, it expresses and protects the interests of whatever the ruling class is. So that state body needs to be taken over. There needs to be, workers' power in that sense. And then slowly, once that takes place, the state would be kind of eroded away as class distinctions start to decrease. And class distinctions would start to decrease once you start to transition away from ownership over the most important parts of society, once there's more equal distribution.
I guess that's where I get confused then, because if you take the inverse, well, I guess it wouldn't be a complete inverse. If you just take an anarcho-capitalist, someone who believes that the free market ultimately should determine the direction of society, and that the state just gets in the way of it, right? So that's almost, when I'm hearing you describe the socialism dream, it's almost like I'm hearing you describe the same thing as an anarcho-capitalist's dream, is that is that the state is no longer serving the public. The state is no longer serving or sorry, not the public, but the ruling class, as you described. So in that scenario, it really does, the power gets handed over to the people who are actually producing, right? It gets handed over to the workers. In an anarcho-capitalist society, it's only the free market with absolutely no state. So tell me how that's different than the communist dream, which it seems to be the same thing. It seems to be this desire to get rid of government, which at the end of the day is comprised of people. Tell me if I'm going crazy and hearing the same principles described in opposite ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, there's a lot to go into there. The difference between a want to get rid of the government or the state because the government or the state interferes in the free flow of business, interferes with a market that I don't know supposedly just works on its own. And what I'm talking about in terms of getting rid of the state is that the first one sees the state as the issue, like as the problem. What I'm talking about is that the problem, the state, is only the manifestation of kind of the authority and the power of the ruling class in society. So there is an even bigger power standing over us all in that sense. And that's, I don't know, at this point, it's like 70, 80 people who own as much wealth as beyond, half of the world's population, and how the state suits their interests. So that's one thing. The problem is not that once you get rid of the state, the problem is not getting rid of the state so much as taking control of the system of oppression that one class uses to dominate the other, i.e. the state. So that's one sense. The other is that I don't really know how a free market kind of works without the state, because, especially now, but even before, the state was so involved in propping up the economy and bailing out the banks and signing the military contracts that keeps, the military industrial complex going. The state always creates policies that are in the favor of capitalism. The two seem to go almost hand in hand. So that's something that I've never really understood about this idea of it's the government that is in the way of an otherwise good market. What I can understand is people who want to make even more money saying, I don't want any more FDA regulations. I don't want any more EPA regulations. I want to make as much money as I can. That's what's happening right now. I want to scratch all protections equals protections, but I don't see them as protections. I see them on a hindrance on my ability to make even more money. So that's kind of how I see that argument used in reality.
Yeah. I guess the next thing is, I would say I think maybe what Tommy was getting at a little bit with the light bulb example, and sort of going back to what I was saying about offering things. Me personally, Michael, also want to make a lot of money, but just saying that doesn't mean anything. I guess in that free market system, which does exist to some extent, that is a capitalist society. I have to provide value to people. People have to want to buy from me. Like the EPA and the FDA could be regulating me, and causing my profits to go down. But at the end of the day, the amount of money I make is inverse. I like the word inverse, and I don't think I ever use it right. I guess what I'm saying is that in order to make money, they're providing value to some people. They're feeding some people in the FDA case, or they're medicating people some ways with the FDA. So in the socialist mindset or the socialist worldview, what's the incentive to create value for others? I don't understand.
The incentive to create value for others, I think, is that there's a recognition that, that's a good question. I want to say the incentive is that we're all in this together, which is true, of course, and I don't think understood well enough. But it's also kind of moralistic, and I like to be able to ground things that in stuff that's harder than just a moral. What would drive the production of goods and commodities in society would be based on what people need. And that seems like a pretty radical proposition.
It's not. That sounds like the free market to me.
Well, except I don't think it is, because if that were the case, why are there so many people in the world who are starving? Why? Gosh, I was just reading that something like 13 or 15 million people in this country have lead poisoned water. Why are like 40% of children, living in poverty? It's pretty clear that the free market doesn't take care of people's needs. And I think at the end of the day, provides for, extreme wealth on one end and real misery for people on the other end. I haven't seen it work, at least so far.
So then my question to you would be, what's the alternative? And then how do you define poverty? Because if we rewind 600 years ago to the Middle Ages, where people were living in absolute confusion and desperation in a religiously constrictive society where there really was serfdom. It was complete. I mean, the amount of wealth was really actually at the 1%, and the rest of the world was either living in ignorance or in disease or in starvation. So in a way, I see that the growth of capitalism has provided the world with the amount of wealth that has been before unheard of with the average person. If you take the richest king living in 3000 BC, that king still could die from breaking his leg and getting gangrene, which is a very, very treatable thing by someone even in a second world or third world country today. So my question to you is, as society does keep advancing, are we going to keep changing our definition of poverty? I'm not going to negate the idea that there is deep problems with poverty and starvation in the world today. It would be ignoring reality if I did. But don't you think that in general we've grown and advanced and provided more wealth for more people than ever before in history?
Yeah, so I think there are two things there. Marx was pretty clear on this, and I think he's correct. Who am I to say anything like that? But capitalism was the next advancement of the means of production coming out of feudalism. So capitalism was a revelation. It got rid, think about the, he calls them bourgeois democratic, but the bourgeois democratic revolution of, in France and in Germany, these revolutions that come along with a changing economic structure that get rid of, monarchies, that get rid of all these backward ideas. You have science that bursts into the picture. And you're totally true. Capitalism has played its role in terms of creating the structure and the opulence and the wealth and the knowledge and the know-how that humanity needs in order to keep progressing. the thing is that like every other previous economic system, it's progressive and revolutionary when it starts out, and then it starts to fade away. And as it fades away, as its contradictions start to catch up with it, it starts to hold back humanity from actually advancing forward. So then the second part, the way I define poverty is how people could be living given our current know-how and source and all the resources that capitalism has created.
Yeah, but I'm just trying to hammer down on your view here. I understand your qualms against capitalism, but the like the solution is the Marxist one, is the state provides everything for you. You don't have to starve again because the state will provide everything for you, give you everything, all of your means, all of your livelihood. Is that your position?
The solution would be that I think that would be part. I think that would be part of the path on the way to the solution. Yeah.
So there's no entrepreneurship in your world, though, right? I can't own my own invention and sell it on my own, right?
No, you could do that. You could do that. You just couldn't force people to work for you.
I can't. I can't. Well, of course, I'm not going to force anybody to work for me, but I can offer a wage, an agreed upon wage for them to work for me if it's accepted by both parties, right?
Sure. And they might say yes, but they also might say no because they no longer need to work. They no longer need to make money in order to survive.
Okay. So so in your world, then I'm allowed to, like, if I in the light bulb scenario, I invent a light bulb, I do hire people on an agreed upon wage, I use modern technology to help the production line, and I sell this and make massive amounts of money. I mean, it sounds like a free market. It sounds like capitalism.
Well, this term kind of free market, people under capitalism are free to sell their labor to whoever purchases it from them. But if they cannot find someone to purchase their labor, or if they are not paid enough in order to survive, they're also free to starve and suffer. And this is the contradiction. Capitalism is a system by which the capitalist, on the one hand, is forced to maximize profits in order to survive. And the only way that you can maximize profits is by driving down the amount of money that you pay to your employees. And that takes very different forms.
Well, no, but I'm talking about in the world of your socialism, state-owned everything, right? So no one's starving, but I'm trying to become extremely rich. So I make my own, I invent my own product, and I have agreed upon wages, right? And I sell this need, right? Because I mean, because this is not Marxism, is what I'm saying. I'm owning all of my property, and I'm going to sell it in a free market. And you just said that was acceptable, right? Or am I not allowed to do that under your world of current Marxism?
I think what I'm trying to get at is that, well, I'll say it this way. Right now, I can't think of any reason why you wouldn't be able to do that. And I'm also kind of aware that I think we're operating all within this framework of thinking that you have this Stalin-esque state, right? Ready to jump down on you should you do anything wrong. I'll just put that out there, which I don't think is true. I also just don't think that you would have very much luck saying to someone, hey, come work to me for $15 an hour, or maybe even $100 an hour, when I could be exercising or creating a piece of art or spending a leisurely day at the lake, because I have no need to work for you, because I don't need your money, because money becomes useless if I have everything I need. You know, money's only good because I need it in order to buy the things I need to survive. I don't care about money, but I do care about being able to pay rent or buy groceries, or etc. If I can do all of that already, if I have free housing, if I have enough food, I personally wouldn't be interested in working in your factory. So you could technically do that. It's just that once the market is no longer built on the production of things for profit, which is capitalism, and is instead designed for producing things that people need, which is socialism, it's kind of hard to imagine a situation in which they kind of both exist, if you get what I'm saying.
Well, okay, so I understand that, if people don't need that, you could be exercising or creating art, but what about if you want to travel the world, right? Or have an expensive bottle of wine, or eat some extremely decadent food, or exotic vacations. I mean, there is obviously, you you have everything you need, but what about what you want or desire, or extra things? I mean, I think that's pretty easy to influence in human nature.
Well, that kind of just gets into the question of, well, maybe it's not getting into the question of human nature. Human nature is something different. I think, maybe that would be a good conversation for another time. Like, what is human nature? Because that's another big thing. I don't know. It sounds like now we're just kind of talking about degrees of want, and I feel like on one hand I could just say, well, in this world, no one would ever need to want anything, and I kind of think that's true given just how much wealth currently exists. Yeah, yeah. Does that kind of?
Yeah, so I think that you're definitely right. I think at the core of this, communism and capitalism as philosophies, as systems of economies, are inherently social because they don't exist unless is a society, if there's large amounts of people that need to operate together. So that's what we're talking about is how do these different ideologies, how do these different economies work given what we know about human nature? When you talk about humans evolving through thousands and thousands of years, developing frontal lobes that allow us to think abstractly, that allow us to build the kinds of worlds that we can create for ourselves. In the experiments we've seen so far, we've seen it. I mean, we've seen it happen in real time with the Soviet Union, with Cuba. Right now, Venezuela is kind of collapsing under this. So my question to you is, if we're sitting in the high school science lab of the world, and we have one side of the classroom with their test tubes on one side and the capitalist side, and then on the other side you have the students with the communism side, and their beakers are exploding, their equipment's catching on fire, things are falling apart. I think, to me, the answer is pretty clear. When actually using the scientific method and using these experiments in real world and seeing how humans operate once they're given these rules and these frameworks on which to move forward, it seems to me that once this communist or socialist dream is enacted, that people act the way they act. And I go back to that first sentence I uttered. Socialism is what can I get from me, and capitalism is what can I get from me, and the only way to get that is to figure out what other people need. That's what I'll ask you is, most Marxists, most socialists I talk to, they always say, oh, forget about the Soviet Union, oh, forget about Cuba, forget about Venezuela, forget about all of these places, forget about China, which now, of course, is a lot more capitalist than it is communist. It's still a totalitarian state, but it's not. But its economy is capitalist. and they always say that the real time to shine for Marxism has yet to come. From my perspective, just what I know about history and what I know about the way people are, it seems that the jury's made their decision on how these systems actually work when real people in the real world are given these powers and structures. So, what would you say to someone who takes a look at what we've seen so far and says there's still hope for? Well, I mean, that is you. You say there's still hope for this socialism or Marxist dream. So where's the hope lie? I don't. Help me understand.
Well, in my darker periods, I also ask myself, where does the hope lie?
In general, right? Yeah.
I mean, first, I wouldn't maybe paint as rosy a picture of capitalism. I think one of the reasons I often think to myself, where does the hope lie, is because, I mean, the problems facing the world have never been greater. And that's because of capitalism. It's not because of socialism. I was just looking at an article by Forbes talking about how in 2050, capitalism will likely starve the vast majority of people. Right now there's the biggest famine in Africa and the Middle East since, I think, 1945 or something. And that's not to mention that, global warming, climate change is not only happening to us now, but is kind of just lurking right around the corner.
But wasn't that the hallmark of the Soviet Union? Starvation, 50 million people. So is capitalism buying us some time?
Certainly, yes. A lot of people starved in the Soviet Union. I think that actually feeds nicely into part two of my response, which is that I'll have the same response. I have the same response, it sounds like, as you've gotten from other folks, which is to say that Venezuela, Cuba, Russia, China, these were not socialist countries, and that it's easier to call yourself socialist than it is to actually be it. One of that reasons being that it's easier to control people after there's been a major revolutionary period. If you say, I'm still with the revolution, I'm still looking out for your needs. Mm-hmm. It's still communist, it's still socialist, don't rebel against me. Yeah. The one issue that I think is very important, and there are a couple reasons why why none of these countries are doing very well, or why they didn't do very well. It's because capitalism, one of the things that makes capitalism great, as we've kind of talked about, is that I'll say this, one of the things that made capitalism revolutionary was that it is a global system. It's no longer about people isolated and, perhaps having their productive potentials trapped within just a nation state. It's a system that transcends the globe and combines human productive potential on a global scale, which is incredible. Every one of these so-called communist states, though, went along the lines of socialism is something that it can exist in one country, that it is possible to exist that it is possible to have a socialist economy in a microcosm, or just submerged within the global capitalist economy.
Yeah.
And so the reason you have things like mass starvation is because that's what you get when you think that you can, somehow exist independent of, a global capitalist market. So here's a way to look at it. Socialism is about passing through capitalism, in a sense. socialism is not about going back to, hunter-gatherer society. It's not about destroying factories. It's about harnessing all of the potential we have, but doing it in a democratic way. And the reason you have to harness it all is because it's a global system. So I hope that made sense. It's the idea that you can't. It's a flawed idea, and this is something that the people I think who are really important to follow really fought against. This idea that you can create what people need, but somehow isolated, by shunning like the most productive parts of what already exists. And then, I'll stop there. I
Okay.
kind of forget the rest.
Yeah.
Of those 2 points. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's pretty evident with Cuba having $4 billion per year for their economy. Most of their economy is people sending money back from other countries.
And I'll also just say this: the U.S. worked its butt off not only to kill Fidel Castro, but to make sure that nothing survived.
Well, that's really interesting. You bring up his name. What are your thoughts on Fidel Castro dying, or what are your thoughts on him in general?
It's complex. I think that a force that stands in the way of U.S. imperialism and can call out the hypocrisy of U.S. imperialism, and freedom and peace in the United States is really commendable. He also did a lot to support the independence movements in a lot of countries in Africa, and also there are some really great systems that were created with him in power under his rule, because that's kind of what it was.
Well, yeah, with a net worth of $900 million, I would agree with you.
Yeah, so that's the other thing. There are good things he did, and it wasn't socialist, it wasn't communist, and he called it that. And I think that does a disservice to what these things actually are.
Well, that's
always
go ahead, Tom.
How it is under that. Well, that's always been how it is under every time there's been a communist system. You end up with a very rich dictatorship. Like every time. I mean, I know you said something that was interesting to me a minute ago. You said that socialism is a great idea when you're not a socialist. I think it's easy to talk about, is what you said, right? It's easy to talk about socialism, and then it's a much different thing when putting it into action. And I find that interesting. I was reading some statistics yesterday about socialism in millennials, and it was 43% of all millennials agree that socialism is a good system. And then that number goes down to a little less than 25% when those same people make over $40,000 a year. And then that number trickles down to nearly zero when they have kids, right? And I'm not going to claim to know about your personal financial history, but I'm assuming that your parents would put you through college, right? And you're well off right now, right? And I think that it's really fun thing it's a fun idea to talk about, especially sitting around late at night talking about this type of philosophy. But it's just I don't see a practical application of this ever happening.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it is fun, and maybe it would be funner if it also just wasn't so serious. I mean, part of what drives me is being acutely aware of the problems that exist in this world and feeling like this is really the point that we've reached, in which not only will the current system not do, but minor reforms, incremental reforms, deals, kumbaya circles, what have you. Those are not things that are going to get us to, in terms of the stat that you mentioned, socialism, maybe, I'd like to think socialism is how I think of it, or how Marx thought of it, or how, all those folks thought of it, is very popular. I think it's more socialism as how Bernie Sanders thinks about it. But that's something that's good too. That's a start. And it also makes sense that either as people are lifted up into, into whatever higher position they can get into, they start to think less about changing the world. It also makes sense that once people start getting, at risk of calling having kids a burden, but just, get
More
get
responsibility.
getting weighed down in the minutia of life, they also start to think about other things. I'm not going to lie, there's a real crisis in terms of the dire situation that we find ourselves in, and the power that we have to do something about it.
Okay, Luke. Yeah. So sorry, I don't want to cut you off.
Fine.
No, I just want to say you've been really generous with your time, and I know you've got to get going pretty soon. I just wanted to wrap up with one last thing. You mentioned that it's a dire situation, or that it's so serious, right? When I went through Cuba on billboards everywhere driving through there, I saw over and over again Socialismo or Muerte, socialism or die. And it seems to me that this revolutionary or serious nature that you seem to approach the issue with is sort of the position that Castro took. When the Soviet Union collapsed, people were starving in Cuba because all the money that they were getting from the Soviet Union was no longer flowing in. And around 1992, it was just the worst time ever in Cuba. But they continued to go through socialism. So and they refused to give up power. They refused to engage in more capitalistic system. So my question to you is: do you identify with that motto, Socialismo or Muerte? Is it really socialism? Is the ultimate goal, and if not, then and we die trying to fight it, then so be it.
We're all doomed.
I think that capitalism will destroy us, and because then I think that socialism is the necessary, most logical outcome or way to transition through capitalism, then then I guess out of that you could say it is socialism or death. It might be a slow death, it might be a death by incremental heating of the atmosphere every couple of years, but yeah.
Okay, awesome. Well, Luke, thanks so much for coming on. Tommy, you want to say anything else?
Well, I was just gonna add. I think I believe that you'll change your stance on that once you require more responsibility.
Okay. Well, we can. Please, if I don't know, we can do a follow-up podcast in 10 years, but sooner. But sooner.
Yeah, hopefully sooner too, because I had a really good time talking to you. Well, thanks for coming on. Duh.
Thanks, Luke.
No, I really enjoyed it too. Yeah, thank you guys.
Awesome. We'll talk again soon.
Yes, please.
All right. Talk to you later.
Ready.
Bye.
Bye-bye.